without further ado, over to you, Jeremy. Many thanks for helping us to think on this important topic of turbulent times and wise choices.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. And I hope all the participants, I'm sure all the participants have found value in the conference so far. I hope you'll find value in this conversation. And my idea for the next hour was that I'll kind of give a presentation touching on some areas that I think are valuable for maybe 35, 40 minutes. We'll see about that. And please, if you do have questions, pop them in the chat, and then Dagmar will re-enter again and kind of help moderate the conversation around questions, etc. And if things get, not just if they get slow actually, but I've also developed a few little polls so that we can interact with each other by sharing collective insights in answer to some questions. So I hope that will be of interest to folks. I'm going to bring up the presentation now. So I hope that is now visible. If somebody can tell me in the chat box or something, or just let me know whether the presentation is visible, that would be helpful, because if it is, I will go forward. But if it isn't, okay, yes, I can see chat folks coming in on that. So that's much appreciated, giving me the feedback there. And so just to put this in the context of the overall program for the conference, what we have here is just a little comment that I've made about how I hope this session will relate to the Sustainable Development Goals that have been a bit of a frame for the whole conference. And because I'll be talking about the turbulent times and wise choices, but with energy-related context there, clearly issues like renewable energy and climate action, and indeed development, economic development, innovation and infrastructure, all those will be touched upon, or at least this conversation should have relevance for that. But basically, because much of what I will be thinking about or talking about is mindsets, the way we think, the way we approach things, how do we grapple with radical uncertainties and still make wise choices in the context of sustainable development. I think what we will cover will apply to developments, or can be applied to developments in all the areas that are mentioned. So this is a little bit of the ground I'm going to cover, and I'm going to be encouraging an open inquiry mindset, and I really see three intertwined threads in that. So it's not right to separate them, but those three intertwined threads are a scenario mindset, and we'll talk a little bit about that, about having slow, strategic, systems type conversations, deliberations in making choices, and finally also in the context of those scenarios, that those conversations lead us to seeking minimum regrets. In the turbulence, we neither want to miss opportunities nor have catastrophic losses. And this way of approaching these rough times, I think, can help us with those different possibilities. So just now, thinking about the turbulent times that we are living in, and on the right of this slide, you see a number of different factors, structural factors that are driving turbulence. And one of the aspects of this slide is that all those factors were in my version of this slide back in 2007. So we've got 15 years when this has been the case. From a business or commercial point of view, actually, we had the so-called era of the Great Moderation, largely a US business climate moderation in the 1980s and the 1990s. But then these factors are really been driving a particular era of volatility and transitions for a long time. And we've had the recent crises as well. The pandemic has amplified many of these factors, and both the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis has illustrated these developments. So these are important developments, and a lot of people have suffered and are suffering in these crises. But there's a structural underpinning of those, whether that's to do with the macroeconomy, whether that's to do with geopolitics or social political developments, demographics, environmental boundaries, or new technologies. And so when you're thinking about all these different currents in the world, we have to recognize a real feature of reality, that every strong current generates countercurrents. And you can't tell up front, in general terms, which will turn out to be the stronger. So if you ignore this reality, you're fundamentally ignoring something about the world and weakening strategic decision making. I suspect many of you will have been in the session with Jeroen van der Veer earlier, and he was talking about the fallout in the European energy system of the Ukraine crisis. And he made specific reference to the scenario mindset, a scenario mindset that he absorbed whilst he was within Shell, but which he's taking on in life because he finds it important for grappling with these difficult realities, rather than trying to imagine that there's some kind of base case or expected case and some little sensitivities around that. No, there can be fundamental and qualitatively different realities. But if you grapple with that, that can help you make wiser choices and to address the various human biases and flaws in human choice behaviors. And I'll highlight a few of those as we go through as well. This element of the scenario mindset really does mean that you are taking different perspectives. You're trying to look through not only your own eyes, but the eyes of others, pick up the insights from others, see a picture from various angles, and hence see a bigger picture. And my following slide kind of illustrates, for me anyway, something about the value of doing that. So this is a very familiar type of image of the pyramids in Egypt, and here this gives you this sense of the desert, the nomadic lifestyle, the great history of the area, and triggers thoughts about history, about nomadic societies, different set of perspectives just triggered by looking at this familiar image. And yet, if you take the same pyramids and look at them in a different way, you're triggered to think about different things. So this is just taking those same pyramids and looking from a different angle. And now you see the urban development right up to the pyramids. You see issues and are triggered to think about issues of development, urbanization, how the ancient and the modern really fit together. And so I think that, at least for me, and I've heard from many others, just those images have helped people recognize the necessity of considering multiple perspectives and considering multiple possible outcomes and having that scenario mindset. But the scenario mindset and the scenarios that emerge from applying that are a means to an end. I mean, the end is ultimately the wiser choices, the better decisions. And to get to that point, we have to recognize that big decisions are generally collective decisions. Uh, People need to agree to invest in something or divest from something. They need to agree to go in one direction rather than another direction. And so there's a social and psychological process involved in that. And so if you take the social process, I just recap here the conversations that took place over a 3-year period that led to the publication by Shell of the last major external piece of work that I was involved with, the energy transformation scenarios, which helped stakeholders understand the powering progress strategy that is the current strategy of Shell, and which other speakers like Wael Sawan will be talking about later. But that's really rooted in all the work that's been going on for a long time that we summarized in 2018 and 2019 around the external environment lessons, where we had conversations with executive committee members and board in 2019 on key areas, then had more focused discussions in 2020 around key beliefs, but also the consequences of those beliefs in terms of what Shell should consider doing and should consider stopping, and then into rethinking the 2020s as the pandemic hit, and then the energy transformation scenarios. So this is a really good habit. I hope the company will continue to practice this kind of long arc deliberation that's weaving together strategic issues and scenario and environmental thinking. And so that point about slow conversation as opposed to fast conversation, which is important sometimes as well, but is often leads to knee-jerk reactions or jumping to conclusions. And as you have those conversations, then you can look at different possibilities, different choices, different lines of businesses, and compare them in different scenarios and really get a sense of what that choice would look like, but against different outcomes. And because we don't know which outcomes or mix of outcomes will ultimately prevail, this helps us navigate the future landscape to understand what are the prominent features likely to be. And I'll talk about some of those in the energy landscape shortly, but also what are the really critical uncertainties. And you can then really think about what choices are robust, what choices are you taking because you might be willing to take a bet on a particular type of scenario coming out. But also those genuinely wise choices which are robust across multiple outlooks. And for one of those, for example, and I think it will come out in the energy example I talk about soon, being on the front foot in new technology development and cross-sector alignments is very, very, very valuable and across all scenarios. Because if you're on the front foot and things move quickly in the world, then at least you're not left behind. If you're on the front foot and things kind of move more slowly, you have the opportunity to build actually a stronghold and competitive advantage, which may not necessarily pay benefits immediately, but will pay benefits in the long term. So summarizing the mindset of the approach, and here I'm also referring to the work of Dan Kahneman, the behavioral economist, Nobel Prize winner, who really identified things like what you see is all there is as a behavioral trait. We know it's not true, but we often act as though we're trapped in our own history, our own ways of thinking. That rebalancing, thinking fast, the pattern recognition with thinking reflectively, thinking slow, but also countering a skewed loss gain sensitivity. And what I mean by that is that it's been found that uh, people are twice as sensitive to giving something up as they are to the opportunity of getting something new. And that tends to lock people into the status quo. And by having, for instance, scenario mindset, that slow conversation, and then thinking about what's minimizing my regrets, including missing opportunities, then that helps counter that. So those are some thoughts about ways of thinking. And I'm just now going to transfer over to talking about um, the energy space that I'm familiar with, and I know that many of you are familiar with as well. And you know, given the Sustainable Development Goal challenges for this conference, Imagine the Future, just a reminder of probably the great energy challenges for this century, and that is developing the parts of the world where people do not have a decent quality of life, and also decarbonising the energy system so that people can enjoy a decent quality of life with a healthy planet, without which they won't enjoy a healthy quality of life. Development is a strong connection between development and energy, simply because you can't build or move or operate anything without energy. And so what you see here on the left-hand side is the Human Development Index, just shown against the amount of energy per year being used by individuals in different economies. And you see that the large part of the world's population is below 100 gigajoules per year. And that is about a level that we found in various studies is the level at which development can proceed in a way to have a decent quality of life. And the countries on the right, you see, are using much more energy than that. And actually, that points to the amount of energy efficiency gains that are going to be possible as well for the already industrialized economies. But far more people are in those under industrialized economies. And then in terms of decarbonisation, one of the insights we brought forward about probably 5-6 years ago is that you have to think about this sectorally, because end use technology is embedded in end use sectors, and decarbonising them can be very difficult or less difficult. So we know that things like solar and wind can produce electricity, so you can use lots of electricity in the built environment. And so decarbonising the built environment has many challenges, but technically it can be done that way. But then you have those difficult areas such as cement manufacture, steel manufacture, glass manufacture in industry, and also aviation and marine and heavy trucking in transport, where you need basically portable energy dense fuels, molecular fuels, rather than electrons as well. And so with that as the big context for energy, we can ask ourselves, really, what might recent circumstances mean for the world in the coming years? The pandemic, and the European geopolitical crisis, the war in Ukraine. And back over a period of time, we found that people have identified around the world really three top of mind priorities. And they're all there, and people are seeking all of them. They're seeking security, uh, they're seeking the return from pandemic recession into economic and productive health, and they're seeking health, or more broadly, well-being as well. And so you have these three different priorities, and each individual, each society is seeking all of them, but different circumstances, different situations may lead to one being prioritized above the others. And so in Shell, we develop scenarios around what happens in the world if security is prioritized most, etc., etc. I'll come to those scenarios in a moment, but you can see these pressures playing out even in very recent activities. So I'm now part of the guidance for the World Energy Council, and they recently, very recently, conducted a World Energy Council pulse, where they asked members around the world what was on the top of mind for their organizations. And they will continue to do that on a regular basis. And here you see what was most on the top of mind when this work was conducted as recently as April. And you see the the spread here with some differences in different parts of the world, but you see security, the energy security crisis being very prominent, the continuing on climate change, the health of the planet, and the pandemic, the health of individuals, but also the issues around the economy, around supply chain disruptions that are happening at the moment, and generally the productive activity that's coming forward. So those three factors are always valuable to think about in terms of how different priorities around them may be shaping the world. And that's what came through in the last energy transformation scenarios that were published last year by Shell. And so the wave scenario, I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, is really one in which in the 2020s, the wealth first priority becomes most prominent. In islands, the security first, and in Sky 1.5, the health and well-being priority coming first. So I'll quickly touch on each of those just as a reminder. Some of them you will be familiar with them already, but the wealth first is looking at the current situations and having the priority as repairing or boosting the economy coming out of the COVID type recessions, the other challenges in Europe, particularly with what's going on in Ukraine, which sees resilience as emerging from short-term financial security. And so if this is prioritized, it's not surprising then in particular places you'll see surges in economic growth, the return of trade flows, energy use returning to pre-COVID and levels and beyond, emissions growing in the 2020s. Because they haven't received attention, you continue to get growing economic inequality, which was already very prominent before the crises. Naturally, we are already having more frequent weather events, and so with the social pressures coming from inequality and the reaction to weather events, which are blamed on lack of action from others, you begin to get backlashes in the late 2020s and the 2030s, and knee-jerk policy reducing fossil fuels. And so you do get an energy transition, but it's late, but fast. And because it's late, you're not meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. You're overshooting that level by the end of the century. That's one type of outlook. Another outlook is islands, and that kind of builds on that security first priority. The idea that resilience comes from um, autonomy, from self-sufficiency. So there's growing nationalism, frictions in collaborations and trade, the difficulties between China and the US around trade and other areas continue to be prominent. Economic growth stalls, energy demand stalls, but also without that international activity, global climate action slows as well. So the technologies that are already economic continue to make progress, but they are not widely deployed as people are not learning lessons from each other in the development and deployment of new technologies like the hydrogen economy, which is discussed in another part of this conference. So in this outlook, you see slow decarbonisation and still rising temperatures by the end of the century. And then finally, the Sky 1.5, which is really sees resilience coming from reforming the institutions that have been exposed to be weak in the pandemic and in the Ukraine crisis. This general sense of well-being and learning. So just as in the crisis, very rapidly, clinical leads learned from each other across the world about how to treat the pandemic. And there was this hugely accelerated development of the vaccines, a combination of both collaboration and competition working to bring alignments. So this is kind of a learning type of society. People also learned from the examples of what happened post the 2008 financial crash, that green investment actually stimulated a lot of jobs. And so not just from the perspective of the climate, but on the perspective of high quality jobs, you actually get a lot of investment in energy transition, technology deployment, and these deep structural changes lower emissions and enable the Paris goal to be met in this scenario. So that's just talking through three very different types of outlooks, and now just translating that into some of the numbers that are involved in that. All those outlooks decarbonize because the technologies are getting deployed and developed at some speed, but at a very different pace. And only the Sky 1.5 meets the 1.5 degrees. But you get complete decarbonisation of the economy also in the waves outlook. It's just some years later. And if you take that into temperature terms, and this is where work has been done in detail with the MIT Joint Program on climate change, you see here how the different temperature profiles in the world on average develop. It's clear that the choices and priorities that are being made now have a really big impact on how we will be facing the climate implications in the second part of this century. But as I said, technology deployment is ongoing in all outlooks, and energy needs grow in all outlooks as we move from seven point something billion people to 10 or 11 billion people in the course of the period, with higher quality of life in many parts of the world. And so here you see just one of those outlooks, the fastest changing one, but the other ones are very similar, just shifted by maybe 10 or 20 years. The impact of efficiency, the importance of electrification, moving from 20% of final consumption in the world, growing into many more uses and up to 60%, but largely from renewable sources like solar and wind. Liquid fuels are still needed in those areas where you need those compact, energy dense, portable fuels, but increasingly shifting towards biofuels. Similarly, gaseous fuels shifting towards non-fossil based, whether that's bio-based or hydrogen-based fuels as well. So oil demand will peak and then decline, and that could happen within the 2020s, or it might take as long as 2040 if you look at that range of scenarios. Similarly, gas demand, and there's a bigger demand and a longer demand for gas, but also it will become increasingly decarbonised. And as we have in this conference, the energy consideration, the hydrogen stream, you see here just the potential of how quickly hydrogen could be deployed and grow. So there's the scenarios as explained earlier that we've talked about, and just comparing that by shifting the axes to seeing this is very similar to the pace of growth, the takeoff that happened with solar or with LNG almost 60 years ago, taking off, in which of course Shell was a major part of that. And so that just gives a sense, first of all, how quickly things can take off and how fast they can grow. But also, if you look at that left-hand column about how big that is in absolute terms, you actually need to be growing for 30, 40 years to be taking a really big, significant chunk of the global energy system. So, most people, I believe, would like to live in that world that is more like the Sky 1.5 world. And the reason for that is that more of the sustainable development goals are achieved. They're achieved earlier. And so what can we learn about, from history? Some things seem to be very complicated and difficult, and yet we can look back and we now have a solar power industry and a wind power industry that is economic and driving forward. We now have electric vehicles. Things have happened, and things will happen. And actually, crises have accelerated those things. So you can look back and see how the solar industry was really kicked off at one level, at the R&D level, by the oil price shocks of the 1970s, and picked up again in the early 2000s with folks looking for domestic competitive advantage. First of all, in California, with the Assembly Bill 32, which we talk about and how that came together, and then later with the Energiewende in Germany, and later what was being picked up in China as well. So crises also spurred by the financial crisis in 2008 and the green investments from there. So crises can be accelerators because they help drive alignments. And if those are combined with smart policy rules and incentives, I mentioned Assembly Bill 32 in California, and then pioneer leaders, either in making policy or in business, the way that we have seen Elon Musk effectively through Tesla create the electric vehicle industry through his insights on which targets to begin to pursue and which places had the policies that created a good ground, fertile ground for that. So it's these three things together. The alignments, either deliberate or simply driven by people reacting to similar forces, the smart policies and the pioneer leaders are kind of what drives the ways forward. Many of you, I think, will have been in the previous session from Jeroen, where he really talked a lot about the Ukrainian crisis and its impact on Europe. So I won't repeat what's in that. I'll just pick up some of the key points because I've taken you through almost thinking a century. But if we're talking about energy transitions, one question is, what will the impact of the current crisis be on European energy transitions? Russia, the world's largest exporter of fossil fuels. Seaborne trade means that global oil and coal markets will relatively quickly rebalance. But gas is different because, if you like, the cost curve, rather than being highly granular, is highly lumpy and really dependent on big infrastructures like pipelines, like big liquefied natural gas plants, etc. And so we have a big lock-in between Europe and Russia, and that will not change overnight. There is the possibility to reduce dependence. And as part of that, I think it will accelerate the EU decarbonisation drive. The prices for energy in itself will drive efficiency, along with specific policy moves to drive efficiency, deepen electrification with nuclear, etc. Carbon pricing remains very significant in Europe, but there may be a coal detour because of the delayed reducing coal use from coal-fired boilers, etc. You will see EU gas diversification to LNG, more import terminals, more production from the US, but all those take years to get in place. Russian gas exports will move east, but again, takes years to get in place because of the investments required. And so, overall, I believe that European energy transitions will be accelerated, and with that temporary detour on the pace of coal reduction, but that will ultimately be overtaken by the efficiency and the carbon pricing pressures that are being used also to encourage efficiency. But there are black swan scenarios, and I think Jeroen may have mentioned one about how if the conflict was to really deepen and spread and there are really supply cuts, there may be reduced capacity to invest in building out the new energy system. Just a quick view on energy transitions. If I look ahead, these are the kinds of surprises to be expected beyond the kinds of things that we've already discussed. So I think there will be further backlashes on climate issues because the pace of addressing decarbonisation, the pace of policy activity still is behind the pace that is required. And so there will be weather events, and they will be increasingly blamed on lack of action, on the neglect of the issue. And I think, if there is a particular strong El Nino event in the next few years, you will see already in the next few years the first year that on average goes beyond 1.5 degrees. It will be an outlier in the volatility and it will come back down, but it's on the trend upwards. But that, I think, will be socially and politically significant. Because there are more people on the planet, but also there are more pressures on food, and the way that energy is becoming less concentrated, needing more land, thanks to the land required for wind farms or solar use or to grow biofuels. I think you will see more land use backlashes, and biodiversity is a very, very deep issue that's been underappreciated over the last decades. Deepening ideological fault lines. We already see that it's not clear how China and India are really aligning themselves in this growing fault line between Europe and, let's say, the West more general, and Russia. So these energy security issues will push in different directions. I still believe you will see economic inequality issues rising up the agendas, and women's empowerment movements. If we look again at those who have been most under pressure under things like the COVID lockdowns, it has often been women. And I think you will definitely see the impact of new generational cohorts. People say that important mindsets are formed between the ages of 15 and 25 as frontal lobes are getting developed in people. And we have new generations coming through who have been through the global financial crisis, through the pandemic. By the time we're in the 2030s, you will see people like Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, all in very prominent social positions with leadership responsibilities, rather than them being the young people we have seen and got used to seeing in the last few years. So that's just been running through a number of different things, and just as a summary then, just a reminder that I believe when the going gets rough, that open inquiry mindset, where you do think of scenarios, where you slow down and have deep deliberations about what are the structural matters of significance, and then seek to minimize regrets. For example, the regret of going too slow in energy transition versus the regret of going more quickly. And so those, I think, are very important. And a last point, we have been in crises, and I've given you some example about how crises have galvanized people into action in the past. And I happened to be at a great poetry event just last week, and a young poet called Sophia Thakur, in one of her poems, had this wonderful line, and it just resonated with me, that when things break, they open. And I just wonder and hope that the things that are broken now are actually an opening for us to take the kinds of steps forward in the world that can lead to that better life with a healthy planet that I'm certainly committed to, and I know many other people are as well. So with that, I'd like to end the presentation and open up Dagmar to any questions that are around from people, or any observations people would like to make.
We have lovely comments and many questions already pouring in. So I would like to immediately give the word to Jan Hein. I'm just passing the microphone to him and hope he can activate his camera and microphone to ask the question that well, he had several, but I said one is
Okay,
what he can ask.
Whilst that's going on, I'll put up polls that people can interact with as well.
Right, so people can also react to the poll that is up from the screen. I hope you can all see that. Just click on whatever answer you believe is most appropriate. So Jan Hein still not able to fully come on board. So Ed would be the next one. So also asking very broad geopolitical questions. So Ed, hopefully you can join us on the stage. And if that doesn't work, I will be jumping in to help us along, so to speak. Okay, I think some people are not able to join that easily. Somehow activate their audio. No problem. So Ed was referring to. Oh, here we go. Ed, you go ahead. You can ask your question much better. Go over to you.
A lot of things came up, and I think, okay. So there it is. No, I have a question indeed, and it is about the current situation in the world, where the Western dominance seems to be diminishing, and other countries, taking more force and seem to be pursuing different priorities. So in all that, I wonder whether that sort of event was included in the scenarios, and how would that affect the scenarios and outcomes of the global warming and decarbonization initiative?
Some views on that, if I could. So yes, I mean, clearly the demographic and economic trends in the world, which are in gross terms, a shift from the west to the east, are an important factor shaping any scenarios that are there, and it's I think often difficult for many folks in the West to stand back and see that as not a threatening development, but as just a development. And it just so happens that we have enjoyed privileges that others haven't enjoyed in the world for decades and decades, hundreds of years. And if you have a human perspective, I think wanting to contribute to more folks having those benefits that we've enjoyed, and recognizing how collaboratively we can actually make things better for everybody. There are a lot of win-wins into this, but sometimes it needs what I call a shift from a very narrow and short-term perspective on self-interest into a self-interest more broadly conceived. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not thinking of self-interest, but you're seeing it in broader terms. And that includes the ability to invest and enjoy the benefits of those investments in different ways.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Somebody else?
Yeah, I just brought Mark McHugh on board here, who had some good questions around the standard of living that we are on. Mark, would you like to verbalize your question?
Yeah, hi, Jeremy. Just I see there's a bit of a backlash, and particularly from people in our own industry, that are continuing to argue about the increasing need for fossil fuels in the current scenario, because we have to maintain our standards of living, and oil prices are too high, and that's going to impact on the middle class and the working class. All of this seems to be completely counter trend and will not accelerate the energy transition.
Yeah, and in fact, that causes me, I'm going to bring up another poll here as to how you might think, how the people on this conversation might think about energy transition in the light of the current crises. You know, as we've kind of chewed over this, there really is a lot of or a big challenge to the energy to power Europe, certainly currently, and that is going to lead to this real focus on infrastructures that are more energy efficient. It's going to lead to focus on as rapidly as possible substituting gas use with solar and wind power particularly, where that's possible, where electrification is possible. And high prices also will be a big factor, as Jeroen van der Veer said, in motivating energy efficiency, and that will be combined with that focus on carbon taxes that will, or the energy, the trading scheme, the European trading scheme, and so all those forces will work that way, and so I think the balance of forces work that way, but it is no guarantee, but I do know, I haven't had these conversations personally with the very top policymakers in Europe, but Ben van Beurden, the Shell CEO, has had these conversations, and I've had conversations with Ben, and the general feeling amongst the policymakers, and also the types of policies that they are looking to accelerate, is that this will accelerate the European energy transition, but with detours, because the decommissioning of coal will be slowed down for a period. So I don't know whether that's helpful, but it's also interesting to see your to hear your perspective. And you can see in the poll, if you look at it, there is a mix. There's 21 votes about it likely to be accelerate, and 9 votes about generally delaying. And if nothing else, I think this speaks to that the value of that scenario mindset I mentioned as part of the open inquiry, because either of those could be correct.
I think very useful, those questions to make you think, what is our own take on this? I have tried to bring Jeng Pascual and Jan Hein Jesse to the stage, if they're able to activate. Oh, wonderful, Jeng. Here you go.
Hello, Dagmar. Hi, Jeremy. Good evening from Manila in the Philippines. I was just curious, because the different scenarios and the outlooks, I think would generally presume that there's alignment or consensus by, governments, societies to move along a certain path. But I think even in your earlier slide, you showed that different regions have different priorities in terms of, whether it's COVID that's a priority or the Ukraine conflict. So with this, I think there might be a different dynamic that that some regions or countries will choose security first, wealth first, health first. I mean, in the Philippines, we have had the longest lockdown. I mean, we're still on lockdown since April 2020. So you would think it was health first, right? But we're not really seeing much benefit from that, and everyone's clamoring for opening up the economy. I just wanted to test your thoughts on what happens in this scenario where different regions actually take on different paths.
No, I think you're right, and I think that the scenarios can give you a framework for having those discussions, but within them, there isn't an assumption in any of the scenarios that everybody goes along the same path. That would actually lead to more less plausible but more wide scenarios, so to speak, because if everybody did that. So there's a balance that's within that, and that balance, can be, or the team, consider that, regionally according to the circumstances in each different region that are there. But equally, you have to recognize that you don't know what the politics and the socio-political temperature will be 10 years down the road. So, there are kind of real uncertainties that are there, which can be very different from today's view. And so you then actually tend to look at the different dynamics of the scenarios and underlying dynamics of the three scenarios that I mentioned. Really, in waves, it's a short-term self-interest, immediate focus, which then leads to backlashes because other things are neglected. So that you can learn, you can say, well, yeah, I can see that, but this is the kind of lesson perhaps to learn from that. In islands, it's that self-interest being seen in very kind of local terms and self-sufficiency terms or autonomy terms, and you can see the consequences of that. And essentially, in Sky 1.5, that's really societies are learning lessons, either because they choose to learn them or they're forced to learn them. So they learn what has worked well in the past, but also they care about what others are doing well. And so in the medical field, it's learning about the clinical practices in the pandemic, but in the energy deployment field, it's learning that the way that domestic economies, China has driven a lot of its domestic economy around trying to take an advantage in the high-tech and solar industries, et cetera, and that becomes a different kind of driver. So I don't know that it doesn't really answer your question, but it was a very interesting observation, and I hope I've added a few thoughts to that.
Surely. As we're wrapping up, Jeremy, I would like to ask you one final question, which is really around your own perspective on these quite daunting problems that we are trying to resolve here: energy transition and climate change, and obviously, will be extremely hard to address properly. So, how are you looking at that? Do you see opportunities there, or are you also careful and maybe sober in terms of your expectations? So give us a bit of a feel from your own perspective.
My own perspective, okay. People often ask me whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and my answer to that is yes. But let me put it into a bit more context. There's a certain paradox called the Stockdale paradox. Look it up if you've got time to look it up at some point. But he was a US Marine who for years was imprisoned and tortured and nearly died in Vietnam, but ultimately came through the experience. And he was often asked about how do you get through something like that? And he said, well, there's this paradox, really. You have to be brutally honest about what the situation is. And you never have to let go of believing that there's a way through and to continue looking for that way through. So I'm brutally honest about the challenges we're facing, but I know there are ways through, and that by continuing to look for those and exploit them, we will find that things will be better than most people expect if they're only looking at the challenges.
I think that's a really good thought to hold on to. When things are broken, they open. I think this is an absolutely magical sentence. Hope you can give that back to the poet that has mentioned that, because I really, it immediately also caught up with me. So I will continue to share that. Thanks, Jeremy, for today. Thanks, everyone. And we hope to see you in the other sessions. See you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.